They found his teeth first. Small, perfect baby teeth arranged in a perfect circle on the floor of an abandoned chapel in rural Wales. But the boy they belonged to was still very much alive, still very much smiling, and still speaking a language that made grown men weep blood from their ears. This is the documented account of what happened in the autumn of 1847, in a village that no longer appears on any map. The village of Pennybryn clung to the Welsh coastline like a barnacle to rotting wood. 73 souls called it home in the fall of 1847, most of them miners and their families, eking out existence from the iron-rich hills that loomed over the settlement like judgment itself. The sea crashed against black rocks below, and at night the villagers would bar their doors against winds that screamed through the streets like the dying. It was into this forsaken place that he walked on the morning of October 3rd, 1847. Mrs. Gwyneth Davies, the village midwife, discovered the child sitting cross-legged in the middle of the old stone bridge that connected Pennybryn to the mainland. In her testimony, given to Constable Thomas Pritchard and preserved in the Carmarthenshire County Archives, Davies described a sight that would haunt her remaining days. The boy appeared no older than 7 or 8 years. His clothes were wrong, stitched from fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with patterns that hurt to look at directly. His hair hung in sheets of absolute black, so dark it seemed to create shadows in broad daylight. But it was his skin that made Davies's blood run cold. It was too smooth, too perfect, like porcelain that had never known a single blemish or imperfection. When Davies approached, the boy smiled. That smile, Davies would later tell the constable, was the most terrible thing she had ever witnessed. It was too wide, revealing too many teeth, teeth that seemed slightly too sharp, arranged in rows that suggested something trying very hard to appear human. Then the boy spoke. The language that poured from his mouth was unlike anything Davies had heard in her 53 years. It wasn't Welsh, wasn't English, wasn't any tongue spoken by travelers or sailors who occasionally passed through. The sounds twisted and coiled in the air like living things. Davies described hearing her own name hidden somewhere in that impossible speech, but backwards, inside out, as if the boy was speaking from the other side of a mirror. Davies ran. She gathered every able-bodied person in the village, and they returned to the bridge in force. The boy hadn't moved. He sat exactly as before, that horrific smile still splitting his face, and when he saw the crowd, he began to speak again. This time, the villagers heard their own voices echoing back at them from the boy's throat. Not mimicry, but their exact voices, speaking words they'd said in private, confessions whispered in darkness, secrets they'd taken to be buried with them. All of it came spilling from the child's mouth in that twisted, backwards language that made their teeth ache and their eyes water. Reverend Cadwallader Morgan, the village minister, was summoned. A man of stern faith and sterner constitution, Morgan had served as a missionary in Africa and claimed to have witnessed possession and dark miracles. He would later write in his journal that nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he encountered on that bridge. The boy turned his attention to him immediately, as if he'd been waiting. When he spoke, Morgan fell to his knees, hands pressed against his ears, blood streaming between his fingers. In his journal entry, written that same night with a shaking hand, he described what he heard. It was not sound, not in any conventional sense, The words entered through his ears but spread like poison through his entire body. He could feel them moving in his blood, crawling along his bones, each syllable a key turning in locks, hidden deep within his mind. And behind the words, something else, a presence vast and ancient and hungry, pressing against the thin membrane of reality, using the boy's voice as a crowbar to pry open a door that should never be opened. When the boy finally stopped speaking, Morgan discovered he could understand his language. Not consciously, not in any way he could explain or translate, but the meaning seeped into his thoughts like blood into water. The boy was not asking questions. He was making statements, terrible statements about the nature of their world, about the things that lived in the spaces between moments, about the bargains their ancestors had made in caves beneath the village centuries ago. Most horrifying of all, he spoke of their children, of what they would become, of what was already growing inside them, waiting. The villagers tried to take the boy to the village hall, to give him food and shelter while they decided what to do. He came willingly, almost eagerly, but nothing about his behavior suggested gratitude or fear. He moved like water, flowing rather than walking, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground. It was young Thomas Evans, the blacksmith's son, who first noticed the teeth. The boy had been given bread and milk, but he hadn't eaten. Instead, he'd sat at the table, still smiling that horrible smile, when Thomas noticed something white on the floor beneath his chair. At first, he thought he'd dropped crumbs, but when he looked closer, his scream brought everyone running. They were teeth. Baby teeth. 7 of them arranged in a perfect circle, still wet with blood, though the boy's mouth showed no signs of injury. In fact, when he smiled at their horror, his teeth remained perfectly intact, as if he'd somehow created copies of them to leave behind like calling cards. Dr. Ephraim Hughes, the village physician, examined the child that afternoon. His medical notes, discovered in 1923 during the demolition of the old village hall, make for disturbing reading. Hughes documented physical impossibilities. The boy had no pulse he could detect, though he was clearly alive and animated. His body temperature fluctuated wildly, ice cold one moment, burning hot the next. When he attempted to look into his throat, he recoiled violently, later writing that he'd seen something moving in there, something with too many joints. But most disturbing were the boy's eyes. Hughes noted that his pupils didn't respond to light in any normal way. Instead, they seemed to respond to sound, particularly to the sound of his own voice. When he spoke in that impossible language, his pupils would dilate until his eyes became entirely black, like pools of ink, and in those depths, Hughes swore he saw faces, hundreds of them, pressed against the inside of his eyes like prisoners behind glass, all of them silently screaming. That night, the children of Pennybryn began to change. It started with the Evans boy. His mother found him standing in his room at midnight, staring at the wall, speaking in a whisper. When she drew closer, she realized with mounting horror that he was speaking the boy's language. Not haltingly or uncertainly, but fluently, as if he'd always known it, as if it had simply been sleeping inside him, waiting for someone to wake it up. By dawn, 6 more children were speaking the impossible tongue. They would gather in the streets before sunrise, forming circles, chanting in unison, their voices creating harmonies that shouldn't exist in human throats. The boy would sit in the center of each circle, conducting them like an orchestra, and the adults who witnessed these gatherings reported feeling a terrible vertigo. as if the ground beneath their feet was no longer quite solid, as if reality itself was becoming negotiable. Reverend Morgan organized a prayer vigil on the third night. Every adult in the village crowded into the small chapel, praying for deliverance, for understanding, for the strength to resist whatever was happening to their children. The boy sat in the front pew, invited by no one, arrived under his own power. Throughout the prayers, he smiled and listened, and occasionally his lips would move silently, forming words in his language that seemed to twist the shadows on the walls into shapes that suggested claws and teeth. Midway through the vigil, the candles began to flicker. Then, one by one, they went out, not blown by wind, but snuffed by something that moved through the chapel too quickly to see. In the darkness, the boy began to speak, and this time, his voice filled the entire space, coming from every direction at once, above and below, as if the building itself had learned his language and was speaking through its very stones. The villagers heard screaming, not human screaming, but something older, something that predated vocal cords and lungs, the sound of raw existence being torn and reshaped. When the candles suddenly reignited, the boy was standing on the altar, his clothes spread around him like oil, and his shadow, cast by the dozen candles, didn't match his form. It was larger, multi-limbed, and it moved independently, reaching for the congregation with fingers that were far too long. That was when Mrs. Davies noticed the walls. The stone walls of the chapel, solid rock quarried from the hills, were covered in writing, not carved or painted, but somehow grown into the stone itself, as if the rock had always contained these symbols, and they were only now choosing to reveal themselves. The writing matched the symbols the boy had drawn in the dirt when the children gathered in their circles. Dr. Hughes, who documented everything, noted that the symbols seemed to shift when observed directly, rearranging themselves into new configurations that spelled out meanings in the corner of one's vision, meanings about doors and thresholds, and the price of speaking certain truths. The situation came to a head on October 10th, exactly 1 week after the boy's arrival. Every child in Penny Bryn, all 13 of them, walked out of their homes in the pre-dawn darkness. Their parents, waking to empty beds, found the children standing in a circle around the old village well, holding hands, speaking the boy's language in perfect synchronization. The boy himself stood at the center of the circle, hovering 6 inches above the ground, his hair floating around his head as if he were underwater. As the sun rose, the children began to scream, not in pain or fear, but in what could only be described as ecstasy, a terrible joy that came from discovering something wonderful and awful simultaneously. Their eyes went black, just like the boys, and their mouths opened wider than human jaws should allow, and from their throats came a sound that made the stone well crack straight down its center. The ground began to tremble, or rather, not the ground, but the space between things. The fabric of the world itself started to shake, like a sheet being snapped taut. Adults who witnessed it reported feeling as though they could see through things, not physically but conceptually, as if the names and categories that defined objects were dissolving, revealing the raw, undefined substance underneath. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The children collapsed. The boy touched down gently on the stone rim of the broken well, and for the first time since his arrival, he spoke in English. His voice, when it came, was wrong. It was too deep, too resonant, like multiple voices speaking in exact unison, and it seemed to come from inside the listeners' heads rather than from his mouth. "The door is marked," he said. "When the time comes, they will know how to open it." Then he walked into the well. Not fell, walked, stepping onto the empty air above the shaft, as if it were solid ground, descending in a slow spiral until the darkness swallowed him completely. Several men lowered torches into the well, but they could find no trace of him. The well, they discovered, was much deeper than it should have been, dropping down into darkness that their lights couldn't penetrate. And from those depths came the sound of his language, echoing up from somewhere far below, somewhere that shouldn't exist beneath a Welsh hillside. The children of Penny Bryn were never quite right after that. They remembered nothing of the week's events, but they all shared the same nightmare every single night for the rest of their lives. They dreamed of standing at the edge of a vast door, so large they couldn't see its top or sides. And through the keyhole came whispers in the boys' language, teaching them things, preparing them, making them ready for when the door would finally open. 3 of those children, grown into adults, were present at the founding of the Society for Psychical Research in London in 1882. 2 others became linguists, obsessed with finding patterns in language that hinted at the mathematical structure underlying reality. One became a physicist, and her research notes, archived at Cambridge, contained diagrams that wouldn't be understood until the development of quantum mechanics 60 years later. The village of Penny Bryn was abandoned in 1851. Officially, the iron mines played out and the residents relocated for economic reasons. But the truth, recorded in sealed parish records and only discovered in 1967, was far stranger. The adults who remained after that October began changing too. They would wake speaking fragments of the impossible language. They would find their hands drawing symbols they couldn't remember learning. And worst of all, they began to hear the boy's voice coming from the well, night after night, counting down in his backwards tongue towards something they all felt approaching but couldn't name. Today, if you search for Penny Bryn on any map, you won't find it. The location where it stood is marked only as rough terrain, unsuitable for development. But hikers who venture into that area report strange experiences. Compasses spin uselessly, electronics fail, and sometimes, when the wind is right, you can hear children's voices chanting in unison, speaking words that make your teeth ache and your eyes water, teaching a language that was never meant for human tongues. In 2003, a team of linguists from Oxford spent a weekend in the area, recording what they believed were wind patterns through the rock formations. When they played back their recordings, they found something else mixed in with the wind. A boy's voice, clear and close, speaking in a language that caused 2 of the researchers to suffer spontaneous nosebleeds, and the third to resign from academia entirely. The recordings were sealed, the research was classified, and the patterns in that language, those terrible, beautiful patterns, are still being studied in a basement somewhere in London by people who understand that some doors, once marked, cannot be unmarked. Some thresholds, once identified, will eventually be crossed. The boy left 13 children branded with his language. Those children had children of their own, and their children's children are alive today, walking among us, carrying in their genes and in the deep structures of their minds the grammar of something that preceded humanity and will outlast it. Sometimes, late at night, they speak in their sleep, and if you listen closely, you might hear it too. That language that shouldn't exist, teaching you things you shouldn't know, mocking you as it mocked them, preparing you for when the door finally opens and whatever's on the other side comes through. The boy promised they would know how to open it when the time came. Perhaps the most terrifying question is not whether that time will come, but whether it already has, and we simply haven't noticed yet that the door is already opening, has been opening slowly for 176 years, and the things on the other side have been teaching us their language all along, word by word, generation by generation, waiting patiently for us to finally speak fluently enough to invite them in. If this story has left you unsettled, then you understand something important. The most terrifying mysteries are not the ones that get solved, but the ones that are still unfolding slowly, invisibly in the fabric of our world. Subscribe to Untold Stories for more forgotten horrors from history's darkest corners. Because some stories aren't just told, they're still happening, and you might already be part of one